So we could soon be getting new insight into the special counsel's probe of possible ties between the Trump campaign and Russia. At some point today, Robert Mueller's team is expected to make a public sentencing memo about former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Remember him? With an additional sentencing memo by Friday for 2016 Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort, detailing his alleged crimes and lies. Some parts of the memos could be redacted. According to new reporting by chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo, Michael Isikoff, the fact that Mueller is planning to make these memos public suggests he may no longer feel the need to withhold information about his case in order to bring additional indictments. He could be near the close. Multiple sources close to the matter tell Isikoff that Mueller's prosecutors have told defense lawyers in recent weeks that they are tying up loose ends in their investigation, providing the clearest clues yet that the long-running probe may be coming to its climax, potentially in the next few weeks. Isikoff also reports that Mueller's office talked to congressional investigators yesterday as part of an ongoing discussion about whether new subpoenas for testimony by House and Senate committees might interfere with the special counsel's investigation. The response was reportedly that it would not, at least in matters related to alleged obstruction by the White House in the Russia investigation
let's stop right there,
itself.
Because, Daniel Goldman, we have two investigations going on. We have the investigation into obstruction. We have the investigation into the acts that are generally termed under collusion. It seems to me, if you sort through everything that was said yesterday, people that are saying that his entire investigation's coming to the end is missing the bigger point. I think he tipped his hand in the response to Congress, saying, yes, as it pertains to obstruction, you can ask whatever questions you want without any concerns. We're good, because we're basically saying they're wrapping that up. But collusion, I mean, that's a completely different story. I think that little party's just taking off. I mean, they haven't even brought in Roger Stone yet. We've got a long way to go in the collusion case, don't we?
Well, I think you are right. The obstruction investigation is a much smaller, more narrowly tailored investigation that probably was more or less wrapped up over the summer. The only thing outstanding for that one is whether or not they will interview Donald Trump. The collusion does seem to be ramping up in some respects, and I do think that with these sentencing memorandum that we're going to get this week, and that also includes Michael Cohen's on Friday, so we're going to have 3 significant court filings this week that may reveal a lot more information about the collusion investigation than we have seen to this point. But I do agree with you, Joe. Whatever loose ends they're wrapping up, which can take weeks, it's not a function of days necessarily, is probably related to the collusion investigation, and perhaps, you know, a broader kind of bribery investigation now that we've learned about the connection to the Trump organization's own business dealings.
So President Trump made some potentially significant public comments yesterday, lashing out at his former attorney and fixer Michael Cohen, demanding he be given a stiff sentence for his admitted crimes. The president tweeted yesterday, Michael Cohen asked judge for no prison time. You mean he can do all of the terrible, unrelated to Trump things having to do with fraud, big loans, taxis, etc., and not serve a long prison term? He makes up stories to get a great and already reduced deal for himself and get his wife and father-in-law, who has money, off scot-free. He lied for this outcome and should, in my opinion, serve a full and complete sentence, the president saying of Michael Cohen. In a court filing on Friday, Cohen's lawyers asked a judge to give him no prison time when he's sentenced next week. The memo stated Cohen was in close and regular contact with Trump's White House staff and legal team when he prepared a statement for Congress that falsely downplayed Trump's effort to land a deal to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. At the same time, President Trump is praising his former longtime associate Roger Stone over his refusal to testify against him to the special counsel, raising questions over the legality of the president's tweets. The president tweeting, "I will never testify against Trump." This statement was recently made by Roger Stone, essentially stating he will not be forced by a rogue and out-of-control prosecutor to make up lies and stories about President Trump. Nice to know that some people still have guts, says the president, likely alluding to his tweet slamming Michael Cohen over his guilty pleas. That tweet immediately raised the specter of potential witness tampering. Lawyer George Conway, who's the husband, of course, of White House counselor Kellyanne Conway, responded to the president by tweeting citations to federal obstruction of justice statutes. Former acting Solicitor General Neil Katyal echoed Conway's criticism, adding, "This is genuinely looking like witness tampering. DOJ, at least with a non-fake AG, prosecutes cases like this all the time. The fact it's done out in the open is no defense. Trump is genuinely melting down, and no good lawyer can represent him under these circumstances." And the vice chairman of the Senate Intel Committee, Mark Warner, wrote, "This is serious. The President of the United States should not be using his platform to influence potential witnesses in a federal investigation involving his campaign." In a bid to defend his client, the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, claimed Trump's tweet did not amount to obstruction of justice because the president is only encouraging someone not to lie. Daniel, as you said a few minutes ago before we came on the air, that statement from Rudy Giuliani echoes one you've heard from every person you've ever seen tamper with a witness as a prosecutor.
It is the only defense to witness tampering. I'm not telling them to lie. I'm not telling them to lie. I'm just simply telling them to tell the truth. We don't have to go much further than Paul Manafort to understand how witness tampering works. You may remember in June, Willie, that Paul Manafort was charged with witness tampering based on some text messages. And his defense and what they said in their court filing is he was just simply reminding them of what they did so that they would tell the truth. So the fact that Rudy Giuliani admitted that Donald Trump's tweet was encouraging something is an indication, whether it's to lie or not to lie. In this case, he says it's not to lie, but he's encouraging him to do something gets you very, very close to witness tampering.
Gene Robinson, yesterday we saw a full display of democracy and respect for the office of the presidency in Washington, D.C. as President Bush's casket arrived in the rotunda. It's hard to balance what we saw yesterday and what I think many, many, many people felt during the course of the past couple of days and will feel again tomorrow with what we're talking about here today. The President of the United States may be witness tampering, involved in obstruction of justice.
Right. Which of these things is not like the others? And, which of these presidents is not like the others? It is an extraordinary contrast. I will say one thing. The president did visit President Bush's casket lying in state at the Capitol last night, and that was a brief visit, but one would have to say it was proper, it was respectful, and perhaps the way things should be. But with that sort of the exception to the rule, you notice that President Trump was in fact absent from the earlier events of the day, and that was, I think, an enormous relief to the nation, because the idea that a president who so little respects the rule of law and tradition and the continuum of the presidency from Washington to Lincoln to Roosevelt to Trump, it just doesn't. It's jarring, and I assume we will see it will be jarring again tomorrow. Perhaps at the funeral.
We shall see. President Trump's son and executive vice president at the Trump Organization, Eric Trump, fired back at George Conway's criticism, tweeting, "Of all the ugliness in politics, the utter disrespect George Conway shows toward his wife, her career, place of work, and everything she has fought so hard to achieve might top them all. Kellyanne Conway is great person, and frankly, his actions are horrible." In response, George Conway retweeted author Reza Aslan, who wrote, "Wait, did I miss something? Did George Conway pay money to have sex with a porn star right after his wife gave birth?" Yeah. It's really, at this point, Elise Jordan, I don't know. I don't know where they get, and I mean this not to be anything more than I'm just absolutely intrigued by this, where they get their confidence that they could lash out at George Conway for stepping up for what he believes in, given what this president is accused of doing and what he has already admitted or has been proven he has done, especially with porn stars and Playboy bunnies while his wife was pregnant.
Yeah, I don't think that Eric Trump wants to get into a battle of wits with George Conway or a debate about the law in any way.
It's amazing. They do it.
And also, quite frankly, Kellyanne Conway can defend herself. It is so insulting that the men of Trump world think that they are better advocates for Kellyanne Conway than she is for her own self. And she has consistently shown that she can weave her way around any battle, and she does not need a man like Eric Trump defending her.
No, I think she's good.
You know, what's so insulting, Willie, is that when women are always, it's always suggested that women are subordinate to men if you have two people that are in careers. This is exactly what Eric Trump is suggesting of George Conway, that he should basically be subordinate, that his beliefs, things that he's fought for his entire life, his status as a conservative thinker, a legal thinker, should somehow be put on hold because of what's going on inside the White House. They're two independent adult people, and each should be able to pursue their careers and the way they want.
Well, it's also so telling that the Trumps, and Eric Trump in this case, view any criticism of President Trump, even when it's fact-based and well-informed, as it is in the case of George Conway when he talks about the law, as a personal attack of some kind, and that he's going after his wife in some way. It is the most fascinating dynamic in Washington right now. Wouldn't you love to be at the dinner table every night with the Conways, listening to George and Kellyanne debate what's happening? But this is not about a marriage, and I think Kellyanne probably would resent having Eric Trump step in and try to stick up for her, as Elise said. But this is the way the Trumps view the world. If you come with any criticism of the President of the United States, it is a personal attack, and you have to intervene on behalf of President Trump, in this case, your father. But I agree with Elise that Kellyanne can probably handle this herself.
Yeah, she can handle it herself, and also it just shows you how. I mean,
she doesn't want to be treated like a Fabergé egg. That would be important to her.
Yeah, she
is a strong woman and does not need it to be treated like a Fabergé egg.
Hear me roar. In numbers,
know your value.
To ignore. Know your value, Kellyanne. Don't let your husband.
No egg.
Be attacked by men. It's just unbelievable. Like, she can't. Anyway, and I love how Eric Trump says, of all the things that have happened in politics since Donald Trump has gotten involved in politics, of all the people that he's accused of murder, I don't know, or bleeding badly from a facelift.
Yeah, or a psycho.
Or psycho. I mean, or times 1,000.
Yeah.
For Eric Trump say, this may be the worst thing ever yet.
Where's Eric been?
Wow. Yeah. Hey, Eric.
Eric.
Wake up and smell the cat food, brother. There's a lot worse than that. And if you don't believe me, just wait a couple days and follow your father. You really should follow your father on Twitter.
Someone tell some of the hosts at Fox where this is going to.
Could somebody teach Eric how to follow his father on Twitter, and maybe he won't make statements like that. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.